Welcome back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series in VMware. More specifically, we're looking at the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Joining me back in the studios today is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette to help us out. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing swell, Wes. Ready to dive right back in. And in this episode, we are tackling vCenter, which is, I'm kind of glad that we're doing it, because I had to keep saying in the last two episodes that we're using the native client, but we're not going to do that for very long, right? Ultimately, if you have more than one ESX box, which you most likely will, then you're going to want to centrally manage them. And the way that you centrally manage them is with vCenter. So vCenter is kind of a critical piece. And when you go on VMware's website and you go to buy, let's say you just want to buy ESX, then you'll almost always see it packaged as the vSphere suite, ESX combined with vCenter, because that's how everybody uses it. So it is a rare day that they're deployed separate. And the only time I really see it deployed separate is when people are on a shoestring budget, where you just want to get it as cheap as possible, get a few ESX boxes up. And my advice to people like that is maybe VMware is not a great solution for you, that you should probably look into some of the free and open source ones instead, because you can get some centralized management with them. If you deploy ESX by itself, you don't get any centralized management. It becomes difficult to manage it that way if you have more than a few boxes. So if you have, say, 3 or more, it's really a good idea to have vCenter in place. vCenter used to be pretty challenging to get up and running, and it was a bit of a behemoth. They've really made it a lot easier for us in recent years. So it's pretty easy to get vCenter up and going, and now you can control all your systems all from one place and have some really powerful management capabilities that just make it absolutely worthwhile.
So Don, when we go to use or install vCenter, it seems like there's going to be some requirements that we need to know?
Absolutely, yep. So vCenter is a server. So we've got to have a server, but the nice thing here is it doesn't have to be a real server. It can be a virtual server. So vCenter can actually run as a VM if you want it to. Be careful, because if vCenter is running as a VM and the host that it's on breaks down, what happens? Now you lose access to vCenter. How do you manage the rest of your hosts, right? So if you deploy vCenter as a VM, just be aware of that risk that you could have where you get locked out of vCenter and now you've got to manage things from the command line. It's not a fun time, right? So with VMware, there's 2 ways we can deploy it. We can deploy it as a VM, or we can deploy it as a physical server. Either way, it's actually got the same requirements. There's a certain amount of memory that it needs and disk space and so on. And let me see, do I have their page pulled up? Yeah, let me pull this up. So I'll put the link for this in the show notes, but this is the vCenter Server 6.0 installation best practices as said by VMware. And what you'll see is they lay out some basic hardware requirements in here somewhere. And oh shoot, I have to click on the links and all that stuff, but it is buried away in here. But there's 2 different sets of requirements that are almost the same, because it basically depends on how we deploy it. So you've got vCenter Server for Windows, right? If I want to have a standalone vCenter server, which is what I recommend, you are going to need a hardware box that's running Microsoft Windows, and it's got to be Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012. It's got to be one of those 2, right? They don't support Windows Server 2008 without R2, and they definitely don't support anything earlier. It's got to be one of those 2, right? Windows Server 2016 is not on their official support list yet, because as of the filming of this episode, Windows Server 2016 is not officially out. It's not actually RTM'd yet, so it's not supported. But you've got to have one of those 2. Then, if you look down, you'll see vCenter Server Appliance. That is a pre-built virtual machine that already has vCenter on it. So if you want to deploy it as a VM, you don't have to install vCenter. It's already installed. You just download this VM and you import it into one of your ESX boxes, and now it's up and running as a VM. So if you want to run it as an appliance, that's great. Now there's a huge difference between the 2, because this one, when we install it ourselves, we have to install it on Windows. It's got to be Windows Server 2008 R2 or 2012. But when you do the appliance actually runs SUSE Linux. So it's vCenter running on top of Linux. Let's say that you're an all SUSE Linux shop. Well, VMware does not allow you to download vCenter and install it on Linux yourself. The only way to run it on Linux is using their appliance. So it's kind of a weird thing that it'll run on Linux, but they set it up and manage it. They want it to be set up their way. On Windows, you can install it yourself and get it up and going. So that's the big difference, is the operating system under the hood. The hardware requirements are about the same. So if I jump in here to the hardware requirements, they've got those listed, and we can pull them up and take a look. And you'll see basically how they list it is based on how many systems we intend to be managing. So for example, if you have a tiny environment, and what VMware calls tiny is 10 hosts, 100 VMs. So really that's a lot of small and even medium businesses right there fall in that tiny range. You need 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. But if you start getting into some of the larger environments, like a small, which a small to me is larger, 100 hosts, 1,000 virtual machines, you're going to need 4 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM. And this is just for the vCenter server to be able to manage all of this. Now, why does vCenter need so many resources? The main reason is in the background, there's a database. And the database is storing all the details about every host and every virtual machine you have and reaching out and getting updated, and the database is busy. The busier that database, the more hardware you're going to need. And that's why these numbers go up and up and up. When you start managing 1,000 hosts with 10,000 virtual machines, you need 16 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM to power that. It starts to become pretty beefy. If this were the virtual appliance, these numbers are basically the same. If I go back, let's see if I can find that real quick. If I go back to the server appliance and I pull up the hardware requirements on it, you'll see that the numbers are basically the same. So 2 and 8, 4 and 16, 8 and 24, 16 and 32, those are basically identical to what we saw just a second ago. So it doesn't really matter if it's a virtual appliance or physical, it's the same hardware requirements. But I can't stress this enough. Even if you're an all Linux shop and you hate Windows and you think it's the devil and you don't want to install a Windows machine, it's still better to deploy this, to deploy vCenter as a standalone machine, not as an appliance. If you want to do it that way, if you want to do it as an appliance, I recommend that you have an ESX box that is standalone, that's by itself, that just runs the appliance on it. And that way, if your whole vCenter environment dies, you've got this machine that's unmanaged anyway, and it's just running that one appliance and it survives, it stays up. It's not a part of the single sign-on infrastructure, whatever, it's separated out, and then you've got vCenter running on top of it. So there's ways to get around it, but it's better to run it as a standalone system.
Don, are these numbers, when we talk about resource allocation, are these just for the host? We're not even talking about guests at this point, we're just talking about the host machine that's going to run the guests?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what we're really talking about here is vCenter, which is not really going to have any guests on it. If it were vCenter running on top of a host, the host has its own hardware requirements, and those take up extra space and so on. So if we're doing the appliance, yeah, we need to have extra room for that. But in vCenter, what we talk about, like, they didn't show the storage requirements. Let me pull the storage requirements up. So if I jump into the storage requirements for the host, they're going to list right here what you absolutely have to have. And if you look, like vCenter server with an embedded platform services controller and stuff like that, they've got how much space you need. And see how they're saying program files, program data, system folder. This is the software. They're not really counting the database there, right? The database is left off. And the more guests you have and the more hosts you have, the bigger that database is going to be. So a lot of the minimum requirements that they list are kind of understated. They're not really in line with what we truly are going to need to have. And so these are kind of a rule of thumb. But fortunately, these numbers are so low that it would be impossible to hit these numbers if you just set your mind to it. Like if I said, all right, well, if I add up my program files, my program data, my system, 6, 8, and 3, that adds up to 17 or whatever. I think I'm doing bad math, but that adds up to 17 gigs. So I'm going to go and get an 18 gig hard drive. Fortunately, you can't get an 18 gig hard drive. Your minimum is going to be, maybe if you want SSDs, you could probably get a 64 gig and stick it in there. So you're going to have extra space anyway. But the other reality is the bigger your system grows, the more likely you are to move the database off to a separate system. All right. When we install vCenter, if you install the vCenter appliance, or if you install the Windows one, the default is that it creates a Postgres database. So there's a product called PostgreSQL. And Postgres is an open source database server that's designed for databases. I don't want to just say lightweight, because Postgres can do some pretty amazing things, but it's typically designed for quick and easy, simple databases. So if I have a small or medium environment, I can usually just use Postgres right here on the same server as my database. But if things start getting really big, I might need to go to an external database, have a dedicated database server for vCenter. And vCenter supports a few different solutions there. And I've got, let me see if I can find it here. So this is VMware's product interoperability matrix. And what it does is it lets you see which VMware products are compatible with which other things that are out there. It's kind of a neat little service that they provide, and I'll put that link in the show notes. But you can come in here and you can say, like, I want to take vCenter Server, and so I'm looking for solutions for vCenter Server, and I want to, well, for the versions, I don't want every version. I really just want like version 6, which there's version 6 by itself, and then there's update 1 and update 2 that have come out, so I'm just going to add each of those versions in. And then as far as the solution down here, I can pick vCenter Server again, and so I'm looking for, oh shoot, I forgot something important. I was wondering why I had it twice. I meant to pick the database tab up here. So I need to pick the database interoperabilities. That's what I'm actually looking for. And I can pick vCenter Server. Now I'll do it right. And I can put in 6, the update 1 and update 2. Or if I'm running update 2, I can just pick that one and that's it. And what it's going to do is give me a list of databases that are out there and which ones are supported. Okay, and what you'll find is that they don't support all that many databases. There's Oracle 11G, there's Oracle 12C, so the 2 Oracle databases that are still supported today. And then there's Microsoft SQL Server 2008 and Microsoft SQL Server 2012, and I believe 2014, there it is, yep, 2014. So if we go the Microsoft route, you've got 2008, 2012, and 2014. If you go the Oracle route, you've got 11G and 12C. Those are the 5 databases that vCenter supports, not counting Postgres, right? So I guess there's 6 databases altogether. So Postgres is built in. The others are external. You can set up your own database server to manage this, and then you can go really big because that extra database carries all the extra load. So a lot of different options there as far as that's concerned. And during the install, when you go in and do the install, it's going to ask you about which database you want to use. So, for example, I've got the installation best practices that we were talking about a moment ago, and they actually go into the step-by-step for installing it. And when you install it, we'll see it in person here in a minute, but when you install it, you'll get to a point in the install where it asks you what database you want to use, which is right here. And see how it says, use an embedded database, PostgreSQL, or use an external database. And here's where you can set up a DSN and connect to that external database and get it going from there. So you've got that option during the install if you want to run through it. We're going to see it in reality here in just a moment. All right, so those are some of the different things that we need to be aware of as we do the setup. The only other thing I want to mention is when you do the appliance has the web server and the database right there in the same box, and it has a little bit extra attached to it, what's called the Platform Services Controller. Let me get, there was a diagram, I mean, it's not an amazing diagram, but you get this thing here where it shows the virtual machine or physical server, and then it shows the vCenter server and the Platform Services Controller. All right, what the heck is that? Well, in previous versions of vCenter, so for those of you that maybe did the VCP 5 or VCP 5.5, you might remember that vCenter was made up of like 4 different components. Now vCenter is only made up of 2 components. They consolidated a lot of stuff down. So you have the vCenter server itself, which is the web UI and the management, and the database is considered a part of that, and all that stuff that's part of the vCenter server. And now you've got the Platform Services Controller that's separate. And it performs a few different roles, but the main role that it performs is single sign-on. It's what's managing single sign-on and authentication for the environment. So when we deploy vCenter, we could choose to deploy these together or separate. You could have it separate, where one machine is the vCenter server and another machine is the Platform Services Controller. Now, why would I want that? Well, I might have more than one vCenter server, but I don't necessarily need more than one Platform Services Controller. So I could have one PSC that's then shared across 3 different vCenter servers. If I have a vCenter server for each physical location at my company or something like that, then I might just have one PSC that they all share. Or I might want to have multiple PSCs. And so by breaking it apart, I can now control that individually. But most people deploy them together because it's just simpler. And so when you do the install, you have a simple install mode where they're deployed together, or you can do an advanced install where you split them apart.
Is there a benefit, Don, of separating those? Separating those roles, or you can get, like, if you're in a larger environment, do you get a performance gain or anything, or is it just simplicity?
You can scale bigger.
Okay.
That's really what it boils down to. It's definitely not simplicity. So splitting them apart makes things more complex. It gets harder. So if you want it simple, you keep them together.
Gotcha.
But then you've got limits to scale, right? Because one server can only scale up so far. You can only add so much memory and so many CPUs to a server before you hit the limit of what you can buy. And then you got to scale out. Well, you can't scale out with one server. You got to scale out with multiple servers. And so splitting up the PSC and vCenter is that first step, and then we start adding more servers to go from there. So it is more complex, but that is a benefit that you'll see. Be aware that if you run it all from one server, your hardware requirements are a little bit higher because that one server is doing both roles versus if we split it out. All right, couple other things. I don't want to bore us too much on this one, but prerequisites. If we're going to build our own vCenter server, we do need to install Windows. It needs to be Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012. We need to do all the Windows updates that are available. So any update that's available, get it put on that thing. And then we need to install vCenter, but it's got some prerequisites. We do need the .NET Framework 3.5, which is built into Windows, but it's not installed by default. So you need to go into the add features and add that one in if you don't already have it. So we need to have that. If the firewall is turned on, there's some firewall ports that we need to open up for vCenter. For example, the vCenter server, it's got a web server built into it. So we need port 80 and port 443, or we can change those ports. During the install, it will list every port that it uses. I'll show you on the screen. And you can open the ones you want, leave the ones closed that you don't want, and you can change the port numbers too. Maybe port 80 is already in use on the server, which in fact, I think for the server I'm going to deploy on, it is in use. And so if it's in use, I could change vCenter to use a different port, or I could change that other system to use a different port. It's up to me, right? So those are some of the things that we need to be aware of, and I put it all in the show notes, but you can get it all from VMware too. It's all right here in the best practices of how we install vCenter. All right, so I think that's probably enough rambling on about it. Did I miss anything? I think that's pretty good. So let's go ahead and actually see this in action. Let's get a vCenter server in place. So I've got a Windows server right here. It's just called WinServer01 because I am creative with names. And it's a workgroup server. It's fired up. Just in case you ever bump into this, you can't install vCenter on a domain controller. So if you have that idea, don't. It really does need to be a standalone server. You can join it to the domain if you want, but it can't be a domain controller. Mine's just a workgroup server, so it's not in a domain or anything. So it's up and it's running. I did give it a static IP. Technically, you don't have to have a static IP, but it's a good idea, right? Any server, you usually want to have a static IP. I've got one. All right. I'm running Windows Server 2012 R2, and that's fine because that's in the supported OS. And I'm actually deploying this on a virtual machine. So you'll see that I'm running on VMware for my hardware. So I didn't use the appliance because that's too easy. The appliance, you just import it and you're done. That makes for a short show. But I want to show building up the Windows machine. So the steps that I'm going to follow are the same if I'm deploying in a VM or if I'm deploying on a physical server. If I'm going to deploy it on a virtual machine, though, I'll typically use the appliance. And the main reason is Linux has a much smaller footprint than Windows. So with Windows, you're going to eat up at least a gig of your RAM just for the OS, versus Linux, where it's usually about 230 megs. So you have extra RAM available on the Linux appliance than Windows. If you're used to Linux and you like it, then the Linux appliance is the better choice if you're doing it as a VM. If you hate Linux, though, you can still do Windows as a VM and run vCenter. It'll work just fine. You just have a little more overhead, right? But a physical server is really the best option for this one. Okay, so my server is good. I'm going to go ahead and start my install. Now, when you purchase vSphere, you'll get the ISO images for vCenter along with ESX. And so I've got that ISO image mounted into my CD drive, and I'm just going to launch that installer. It's not terribly exciting. So I'm going to launch the auto run, and you'll get this screen right here. And it's going to offer to install vCenter server, but it'll also offer to install the vSphere client. What is that? Well, in our last episode, we loaded the native vSphere client for connecting to an ESX box to manage it. This is the vSphere client that we could use to connect to ESX as well as vCenter. It's the same client, but the native client is not as full-featured as the web client. So that's the one that I prefer to use, which is installed as part of the vCenter server. So we don't actually need this client if we don't want it. Then you'll see the vSphere Update Manager. That's really useful if you want to do automated updates. If you have multiple vSphere systems in place, you can do the updates for them. And then some other support tools like the authentication proxy. Most people don't use it, but if you need it, it's there. I want vCenter server. Notice how it says prerequisites none. Not entirely true, but it can auto-install a lot of the prerequisites it needs. It can't open up firewall ports for you, though. So there's some things that are prerequisite you need to do, and you can get those from the best practices guide. All right, when I go to install, it's not going to ask me a heck of a lot of questions. There are a handful, especially when it comes to the PSC and the database. So as I move forward, I have to agree to my license agreement. And then here's the choice about the PSC. Do I want to deploy them together, where this is one host running the PSC and vCenter, or do I want to split it up, or I have one PSC and multiple vCenter servers, right? It's up to me. So if I'm doing that, it's called an embedded deployment when they're together. It's called an external deployment when they're separate. And so it's asking me, am I installing a platform service controller or am I installing a vCenter? Which one of this puzzle am I installing, right? Well, I'm going to do embedded. I'll just do both right here in the system because I don't have either and I kind of need them. So I'll just do that and hit next. Now it's going to ask me for my system name, just the host name of this server. You generally don't want to change that, but pay attention to what the name is. Because when somebody browses to the web page to connect to this, if they type in an IP, it's going to flip to this name. So the name needs to be resolvable. We need to have it in DNS and be able to resolve that. I actually don't know if that's in my DNS server or not. So let me just double check that real quick. I'm going to jump into my DNS tool and double check and see if I've got a forward lookup zone, and I don't. So that name actually wouldn't resolve for me. So the first time that I browse to it, if I browse by IP, I'll get to the server, I'll go to log in, and then it'll flip to the name, and I'll lose my connection, right? So I'm just going to whip up a quick DNS zone here so that I'll be able to resolve this. And for you, you'd use whatever DNS server it is that you've got in place. I'm using the Windows one. So I'll just get that in there, and it should auto-create a record. Yep, it did. So WinServer 01, it's in there. It's got a record, and so I'm in business. Easy enough to whip up a DNS server for that. I guess I need to see if I'm actually using myself for DNS. That would be a nice one, but I'm sure I am. All right. I say that, I'll be wrong later, we'll see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get this thing installed. And so I'll hit the install button, and oh shoot, that's not my wizard. Let me get back to the wizard. There. And now I'll hit next. I'm about to launch a second instance of the installer. That would end about as well as it sounds. All right, I am getting a warning about IPv6. It's telling me that it can't resolve the IPv6 address to a name. And that's because I just created a DNS record for IPv4. Well, I'm not using IPv6, so I'm not worried about it, but if I was using IPv6, I'd need to go and register that as a DNS name also. All right, but since I'm not using it, I'll just say OK. And now I get some slightly more important information. When I log into vCenter, I need a username and a password. Where does that username and password come from? Well, vCenter has an authentication database. And the authentication database can be local to vSphere, or it can be single sign-on against an external directory, usually the Microsoft Active Directory. So if I've got that kind of environment in place, I can tie to it. Since this is my first server, I don't have it. So what I need to do is create a new vCenter single sign-on domain. And at least in the beginning, it's just going to be a local database. In the future, I can attach it to the Active Directory, and then I get some real power. But for right now, it'll be a local database. If I've already got a vCenter server up, and this is like a second one or a third one, I can join an existing domain, and it'll connect me to the other vCenter servers. That's not an Active Directory domain. This is a vSphere domain. vSphere servers or vCenter servers that are being connected together. So you don't even have to be running Windows to use this. That domain terminology is a lot more generic than most people think. But this is my first one, so I'm going to create a new one. The default name is vSphere.local. And honestly, that works for a lot of people. If you're going to have more than one domain name, though, then that doesn't necessarily work out. So you might need to give it a name, whatever it is you choose to call it. I'm going to leave it vSphere.local because that's what you're going to see on the exam. But in real life, I might change this to lab.itpro.tv or something like that so that I can recognize what it is. The default username is administrator, and I need to give it a password. So I'll punch in one of my ultra secure passwords, like the word password all lowercase. It might complain on the complexity on that one, we'll see. And then a site name. If you have multiple geographic sites, you can specify a site name. I'll leave this one at default first site name because that's what you'll see in the textbooks. But in real life, I might call this Gainesville or home office or whatever it is that you want to call the main data center where you're at. All right, that's all it needs there. And so I can hit next, and so now it'll know, yeah, it's complaining about the complexity of my password. Let me make something a little more complex so that it'll be happy. All right, then the service. In Windows, when you have a program run in the background, it has to run with a user account. And it's asking me, do I want to use the local system account, or do I want to specify a service account? All right. If this machine is part of a domain, I probably want to use a service account, because then I can give that service account access to other network resources. But if it's a standalone server like mine, I can just use the local system account. I don't need to share it amongst other machines, and so that's the easiest option. If I want to use a service account, I need to go and create a Windows user account in my domain, and I need to grant it run as a service permissions on this server, and then it'll be able to run that way. But if I'm just doing a standalone, I can use a Windows local account, and that'll be fine. All right. Now it's going to ask about the database. By default, it wants to use Postgres, and they call it vPostgres. It's VMware's implementation of it. So I can use Postgres, which is the same as PostgreSQL, or I can use an external database. And when I do an external database, I need to have a DSN. And DSNs are defined, if you need to set one up, you can just bring up your start menu and type in ODBC, and you'll see ODBC data sources. And these are data sources that point to database servers. And so when you go into the ODBC control panel here, you can define system DSNs. And a DSN is a pointer to a database server somewhere. So I could add in, I've got the SQL Server native client. If I had the Oracle client installed, I could choose Oracle here, but I just have SQL. And so I could choose that and specify a server name and a username and a password and all that stuff to connect with it. And so then when I jump back over here, I just need to specify the DSN that I'm going to connect with. And then if I need to override the username and password, I can provide those, and I can connect to that database server. So I've got to set that up kind of outside before I get to here. But in my case, I'm just going to use Postgres. It's a heck of a lot easier. I can change it after the fact, but it's not exactly easy, because I've got to move all my data out of Postgres and into SQL, or out of Postgres and into Oracle. So it's better to have it set the way that you need it from the beginning than it is to try and move it later on. All right. On the next screen, here's where I get all the ports. And so for my firewall settings, I want to pay attention to this. I've got the HTTP port's probably the most important for me to be able to connect to it and configure it. Everything else I can change after the fact if I want. But some of these are pretty important, like the ESXi heartbeat port. I need to get heartbeat messages from the server so I know that they're on. If this isn't set, then things are going to break down, right? So I need to get that put in place and set. Normally you'll leave these alone, right? We don't want to mess with it. In my case, I'm pretty sure I already have a web server running, so I'm going to get a complaint on that port 80. So like if I just hit next, then I get an error. Yeah, there it is. The following external ports are already in use. When you deploy Windows, Windows loves to add IIS. Practically anything you do to it, if you just like click on an icon, it'll install IIS. I don't know why they get so crazy about that. And so your system may already be using port 80. I could change VMware to a different port, but vCenter is the primary product that I care about here. I want it to have the ports that it wants. So I'm going to go, I guess I could remove IIS, but a lot of times it gets put back again. It kind of makes you angry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change IIS's port. I'm going to go back to my server manager and into IIS. And in IIS, I'm going to browse in here and find the default site. What's it complaining? Oh, I do not want the platform manager. So I'm going to browse into my default site, and sure enough, if I look at it, see how it shows a binding on port 80? I'm going to change that. So I'll find the default site, I'll go into its bindings, and I'm going to change it from port 80 to like port, I don't know, 81. Something different, just something not 80. And so I'll get that set. There we go. And so that's in place. That'll get it off of port 80. And now when I go back to my vCenter install, if I hit next, it's a lot happier. Okay. And then from there, I just pick my file path, so I'll leave it at the default. If you've got more than one hard drive, you might want to pick a different hard drive. I don't really care. And I'll move forward. I can participate in the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program, which means anytime we crash, it sends a message to VMware. It's entirely up to you. Since this is a lab, I'm going to turn it off. In real life, I do normally leave it on, try and help find problems. And that should be about all the information it needs. It gives me a nice little summary here, and then we'll hit install. So once that's done, vCenter installation is going to kick off, and off it goes. All right, now this process, it takes a while. It takes, for me, it seems to be at least 30 minutes for it to just go through, because it does a lot of stuff. It's setting up the database. It's pre-populating the database. It's setting up its own proprietary web server. It's got to get the pages loaded for that. It's got to get the system in place and services started. All this other stuff is happening in the background.
So Don, we're going to have an episode, 30-minute episode of a progress bar.
That could be the case. So fortunately, I think I've got it out here. We don't have to wait for it because I think we're almost out of time in the episode anyway. So why don't we do this? I'm going to let that thing churn along. And it literally, I mean, if we look at it, it's a green bar, not a blue bar, but a little green bar that's going to slowly move from this edge of my screen all the way to this edge of my screen. And when that's done, vCenter will be up and running. And just like we saw with ESXi, I can get connected and start to do some basic configurations in it to get it ready to go and put in use. But that might be better suited for a part 2 episode. What do you think, Wes?
It sounds good. So we're going to go ahead and end this episode. Don, anything you want to throw into this episode, or are we going to save that for part 2?
Just remember that there were a lot of decisions that I made, and on all of those decisions, they can be changed after the fact, but it's not exactly easy. So plan for the future, right? plan for scoping that out the way that you want. You might know that your environment is small today, but if you know it's going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, go to an external database right away. And that way you can have an external database on a small system and you can just upgrade it and increase its resources over time versus trying to migrate from one database to another. That's not exactly easy. The other thing is, remember with vCenter, we can do it as a VM. I'm doing it right here, but it's kind of better to have it on physical hardware. That way if your environment is damaged, you can still get into vCenter. If you get locked out of vCenter, troubleshooting and supporting your environment becomes very, very difficult. So you want to have that tool available even during a failure.
Well, Don, we thank you for taking us through the installation here. We appreciate you, the viewer, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.